Okay. Any questions before we get started? I know I will answer one question you probably have, and that is when you're going to get your grades back from the first exam. My goal is to have them posted by Thursday. And if that's true, then I will also have them available for you to pick up on Thursday, or not on Thursday, on Friday as well, okay? Now, I may get it done before then, but I doubt it, quite frankly. So my goal is Friday. The reason why is because I'm reading your essays. The multiple choice part is already done, okay? Because that's easy. Crank it through the machine, and it's done. But I'm reading your essays, and that takes me some time. And I like to post both scores at the same time, which is why you don't see your multiple choice, because I can tell you from experience, if I just post your multiple choice, I will be getting panicked phone calls and emails wondering why the person failed the exam, because they only see one part of their score. So that's why I don't do that. But I got told today that the average score percentage on the multiple choice for the class was 74, which is about right. That's the average, and that is the sort of ideal average. I'd like to see next time that average go up. Sometimes the average is higher in this class. So, from my perspective, that's good news, but I always like to see it move up. I have no problem with that. And I want that to happen. So anyway, Friday, you can pretty much count on those exams being back. And when I start handing them back, I expect you to pick them up. And as the syllabus says, if you don't pick them up for 2 weeks, then you're seriously delinquent in your attendance, and the letter grade on your exam will be lowered by 1 letter grade. And since you guys are here, this probably doesn't apply to you, but that happens to people, unfortunately. I like people to pick up their exam so that they can keep it for the final exam, so that they can take a look at how they did on their essay, and I do write feedback on it. And then you also have something if you need to come and see me before the next exam and you want to talk about how to deal with that and do a better job, then you've got that there. We can take a look at it together. Okay? So that's why I give them back. All right, well, today we're going to get into this next unit, which is on realism, and we're looking at realism through the eyes, particularly of Machiavelli. And also, we're going to be reading Sun Tzu's The Prince. Sun Tzu is another ancient Chinese thinker, and mainly a military thinker, but a lot of his ideas have been translated into other realms of life. So we'll be taking a look at Sun Tzu as well. And unlike with Confucius, we'll be reading Sun Tzu, so I'll be assigning passages and portions of that book as well. What I want to do today is orient you towards Machiavelli, give you a little bit of information about who he was and where he was and the context in which he was writing, what was going on at his time. And as we talk about this, keep in mind there's a question that a lot of people have when they're reading about Machiavelli or studying Machiavelli and his realism, and that is how much of his realism can be attributed to his times, and how much of it could be taken as permanent in nature. In other words, always true, okay? As opposed to what was influenced by his times. Because as we'll see, he lived during very chaotic times, okay? And many realists are born, you might say, or develop during times like this. Of course, when you look at the history of the human race, these are not unusual times, okay? And that's another thing we need to keep in mind. We're living in relatively unusual times, at least in this country, for the most part, free of major violence, war upon our soil, etc. But actually, if you think about it, that's not what the normal human experience is like, okay? So, from that perspective, maybe Machiavelli was living during normal times. But here's his dates. He lived at the very beginning of the Italian Renaissance, during the birth of the Italian Renaissance. Okay, and he was from a city-state in Italy, because Italy was not a united country. Okay, we say Italy, but we're talking about a territory or an area at this point, because one of Machiavelli's big problems with the politics of his day was that this area was not united, had not formed into a larger country, and therefore he thought it was at a disadvantage vis-a-vis some other countries in Europe that had already. So let me have you take a look at the map here. If you've got this book, you've got a map in your book at the very front that kind of shows you just how split up and divided the Italian area really was. Okay, there you have the Republic of Florence right there in sort of the north central part. Here you have the Papal States. This was a large territory that was controlled by the church. Okay, and as you know, this doesn't exist anymore, but at this time the church, now the church is Vatican City. It owns Vatican City, but at this time it controlled a great deal of territory here. And it was able to defend it through alliances and also through its own troops. So it played a different role, as we'll learn. It actually was a political force in Italy. So that's an interesting component, and one that Machiavelli was troubled by. Not because he was particularly perturbed by the church necessarily, but he was troubled by the fact that here was this rather big entity sitting in the middle of Italy, and sitting in the middle of this area here, that was powerful enough to control this area, but wasn't powerful enough to take over the whole, but was certainly powerful enough, in his view, to meddle in everybody else's business. So by making alliances and changing alliances and sort of intriguing throughout the rest of Italy, the church, in his view, was problematic. Okay? If it had been powerful enough to take over the whole place, he probably would have approved. So his problems with the church were not religious. They were political. And there's some kingdoms here. There's a Republic of Siena here. Okay, so you get the idea. And these areas, these cities and kingdoms, they did not get along. All right? In a lot of cases, they didn't get along. It was like all separate countries. And sometimes they went to war with each other. Sometimes they spied upon each other, sent assassins to kill each other's leaders, made alliances, just like any other countries. So that's where Italy was at this time. And Florence was first, for Machiavelli anyway, in Machiavelli's experience as a child, it would have been a principality. As an adult, as he fulfilled his role as a diplomat, it was a republic. The Florentine government would go back and forth between the principality and the republic. And the de' Medici family had ruled Florence before, and it was going to rule it again. It was a very, very powerful, rich family. But during the time that he was in the diplomatic corps, Florence was a republic, which does not mean a democracy in this case, and it doesn't even mean a republic such as we have, where the common man voted for representatives. But it meant more like a fairly large aristocracy, a larger group of, but still wealthy people who made decisions as a group, as a whole. Okay? So, in this capacity, as a diplomat for the Republic of Florence, Machiavelli got the chance to gather data from direct experience. And perhaps this is one reason why Machiavelli gets this more realistic view, is that his education, he's book educated, obviously, but his education is also from his experience. And he had traveled quite a bit, both in Italy and abroad. He had dealt with other ambassadors and with other leaders. And so he had that data, that material at his disposal, and he uses it in this book. You can see lots of examples that he pulls from the figures that exist at this time. Okay? So, as it says there, his chief goal in his ambassadorial role was to protect Florence from foreign influence. So this was just an ongoing task of monumental proportion. Okay? His biggest problem for Florence was that it was always its affairs were being meddled in by other countries. And in Spain, as a matter of fact, it invaded this country, or this Florence, towards the end of his life, and took it over again for the de Medicis. He was allowed during the Republican period to try to, yeah.
Did Spain control Austria at this point? The Habsburgs?
Yes.
So is that
I
why
think
they
so.
made it blue?
Well, probably, yeah, to extend their influence. Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know if I misread it, but when I was reading the introduction,
Sure.
it says like Machiavelli thought he was like the. It's a really short paragraph where he was comparing himself to Columbus in discovering a new type of politics, and how he would know, because at that time in 1520 something or 15 something, they wouldn't really know until a lot of years later that Christopher Columbus came to the New World and everything.
I don't think he compares himself. I don't know if he knew about Columbus or how much he would have known about Columbus.
Something about in 1942 Columbus had discovered the New World, Machiavelli.
Right,
No
but that's
discoveries.
the editor's introduction, and not Machiavelli. And see, the editor is extrapolating based upon history of the times. That's partly why I don't have students read the introduction, is because sometimes what you get is you get the editor's extrapolation, and we can't prove what Machiavelli knew about Columbus, but it would be, but I think probably the editor put that in there because we know about Columbus. But the point is, this was an era of discovery, and scientific discovery, and travel, and so forth, and so it was changing the way people think and what they were doing at the time, and Machiavelli is a part of that. He's challenging the old ways and discovering new ways. So it's almost a literary device, I guess you might say. Okay, but I would not want to try to prove that Machiavelli had particular knowledge of what Christopher Columbus was doing. Yeah, no, I don't know if he did or not. Obviously, he might have, okay? But he never writes about that. So, as far as I know, no. Okay. Good question though, but if that's why I don't always have you read those introductions, because what you get is one particular extrapolation. So if you do read it understanding. But it's kind of difficult to deal with, but scholars aren't always right when they write in these things, and they oftentimes express different points of view and opinions, and they disagree with each other. And when students come at this material, they tend to think that it's the gospel truth when they read it. Okay? And sometimes it's not. So it's best to, at least at first, get into the book yourself and read the material directly. All right. I was talking about the militia. This was very important to him. In this book, he gets into how most of these princes and governments fought at this time. And they did not use the common soldier, the common man. They didn't think that the common man could fight. They didn't think he had the knowledge, the skill, certainly didn't have the education, etc. So they either hired mercenaries or they fought themselves. The nobles were well equipped and often did this themselves to defend their own territories. They made alliances with others and so forth. But they didn't think that the common man, the farmer, the artisan, was capable of this. Now, coming at this from our perspective, it's kind of hard to believe that. We have a citizen army. We now know it's quite possible to do. Well, Machiavelli felt the same way, and he tried to promote this idea that you get the average common citizen involved in protecting and defending their country, then they will learn to love it, want to protect it, they'll be the best fighters possible. And that was a really new idea. He got a chance to do this on a small scale during this period of time when he worked for Florence. And they lost to the Spaniards when the Spaniards invaded. So it wasn't a successful one, but it didn't prove to Machiavelli that it wasn't a good idea. Machiavelli thought it hadn't been done on a large enough scale, that it hadn't been done well enough, that they weren't prepared by the time this happened, but that didn't mean that it was not a good idea. And in 1512, the Spaniards did invade. They wanted to control this area for themselves. They brought down the Republic and they restored the de Medici family. okay, which was a very corrupt family that could be easily bought or negotiated with, okay? So they would have worked well with whatever power took over. In the wake of that change of regimes, the Medicis made up a list of people that were associated with the former government. And Machiavelli's name was on that list. The reason why will become clear in a moment. But he wasn't a conspirator. However, he could have been seen as an advocate of republicanism, and in any case, he had worked for that government. Okay? And so, not only was he ejected from his post, but he was imprisoned, he was tortured, and after that, they told him he had to leave, and he could not live in Florence. So he retreated to some lands in the country that he owned. And he lived for quite a while there. So that's part of his background too. He has personal experience with the power of government and the power of fear, you might say, to make people do things. And now you might think a person having that experience would turn into a crusader for humane treatment of others, or, egalitarian ideas and so forth, but not Machiavelli, Machiavelli drew a different lesson from that experience. Okay? Machiavelli decided to go, as I said, to his country home. He had an estate in the country where he had woods which he could make money off of. He brought woodcutters in to begin to bring down timber so he could get some income from that. And while he was there, he did not work himself. He was not in such a financial crisis that he had to do that. But he lived at a much lower level, lower lifestyle than he would have when he was in Florence. He spent most of his time by himself, especially in the evenings. And it was during this time that he wrote The Prince and the Discourses. That letter to Vittori describes very well the type of days that he had. And he says he spent some of his time during the day with the country folks, whom he does not think are his equals by any stretch. Okay? And then when he gets home, he puts on nice fresh robes and he writes. So he wrote both of these works. These are his two greatest works, The Prince and the Discourses. The full title is the first Discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livius, and it draws a lot from the ancient Roman historian Livy. Now, during this time, you would think that Machiavelli would be either terrified and not want to have anything to do with the Medicis, or angry and not want to have anything to do with them. But instead, Machiavelli's desire, his goal, was to get back into the Florentine government. Even though the regime had changed and these new people were in charge, he now wanted to work for them. So some people look at Machiavelli as sort of a hired gun, He'll work for anybody and take away from this some, some notion of his character that may or may not be true. Okay? We know Machiavelli wanted to have influence. It's not necessarily wrong to try to have influence in whatever country or whatever government happens to exist at the time. So I'm not sure we can pin him with that. He did get called back in 1525 finally, but not in anything like he wanted. Not to run the militia, not to rejoin the diplomatic corps, to be an advisor to the prince, which I'm sure he would have loved. But rather they asked him, since he was a writer, to write the history of Florence, which he did write and finished. So we have that. But in 1527, there was a revolution, and the Republican forces reemerged. And not long after that, Machiavelli died, and we don't know exactly what of. Some stomach pain, an illness of some kind, but we don't know why. And that's typically the case with people who lived before the 20th century. You just have no real idea because there's no way of knowing. Okay? So romantically, some people say, well, Machiavelli just couldn't take the stress, here he was, the Republicans were back, they wouldn't trust him either, therefore he died. We have no idea. Okay? Maybe he died because he was sick. He doesn't seem like somebody to sort of give up and die. So I have my doubts about that. As you'll see, Machiavelli thinks you should take advantage of whatever life throws you, which is one of the greatest aspects of his philosophy. It's really very positive, but you have to get past the moral issues. Okay? But he does want us to take advantage of whatever life gives us, and to always think about how to gain the advantage, not throw up our hands in despair. So what we have with Machiavelli is a book that it's going to read very differently than the Gorgias. Okay, so if you like the Gorgias, you may not like this one as much, but if you dislike the Gorgias because of the dialogue format and the idealism, you might really like Machiavelli. Okay? It reads differently because he's got a different set of experiences, obviously, and he's just a different human being. He draws a lot from those experiences. There's two sources for his knowledge. He doesn't quote philosophers. Okay? He quotes historians, and he also provides an awful lot of just the knowledge that he has in his own head from his own diplomatic experience and what he's heard from other people in his own times. So he's more like a contemporary commentator who looks at the world around him, maybe somebody who's been in a government, okay? And from that perspective has a lot of practical knowledge and experience that he can use, and he lays it out in a theoretical way. Okay? But he does draw from ancient Roman history, and one of the big reasons for that is, guess where he is? He's in Italy, okay? And the Romans are the Italian past. They're the people that they, especially the Renaissance Italians, hark back to the ancient Romans as sort of the, like the golden age, okay? And the Roman Republic as the ideal. And so they, the empire. So they wanted to be like the Romans. So it's no surprise that Machiavelli takes a lot from Roman history. Be aware that Machiavelli uses tons of examples. So you can easily get lost in all these examples. If you read these examples and go, God, how can I remember this? Try to relax. We'll go over some of the most important ones in class. What you need to do when you read these examples is ask yourself, what point is he trying to make through the example? Okay? Some of these examples aren't even historically accurate, I can tell you. Okay? He twists historical facts because his point is his point. He wants to make an argument. He wants to make his point. He's not a historian. Okay? So, and he's not a journalist. So don't worry too much about that, but just ask yourself, how does this example illustrate the point he wants to make? What is his overall argument? It's a nice strategy because it makes Machiavelli's writing seem very credible because he has backing for it. He says, I think this and here's why, and I will give you these 5 examples of how a prince did it this way and it worked under these circumstances, and that makes him sound solid, as though you've got something there, some proof. Okay? Now, as I said, this was written during the Renaissance. And so, while the Middle Ages are often called the Dark Ages, I like to say to students, not really. It was in the Dark Ages as though nothing ever happened. An awful lot of knowledge got transmitted from the ancient world to Machiavelli's time via people in the Middle Ages in churches and synagogues in the Middle East, and the Muslims also, who preserved and actually developed ancient political and moral philosophy. Okay? But the Middle Ages was very focused upon God, on religion. Okay? And most of the people who had an education and had any wherewithal to learn anything were members of the clergy or the religious, okay, in Europe during the Middle Ages. They were the repository of that. And the common man was illiterate, okay? And there wasn't much in between, other than the nobles, the church, and the commons, okay? But during the Renaissance, partly because of a growing economy, okay, more and more people made more money, were able to get some form of education, and people began to turn their attention away from purely religious concerns. Those didn't die away by any means, but turned their attention away from purely religious concerns towards more human concerns. And so you see this, for instance, if you go to an art museum and you look at medieval paintings, and then you go to the Renaissance section, okay? When you go to the medieval paintings, it's all iconography almost. It's all religious, most of it is. Depictions from biblical stories, right? And the Holy Family and so forth. And then you go to the Renaissance section, and you actually start to see paintings of just nobles doing things, even occasionally common people doing things. You see a lot of Greek and Roman mythology popping up in these works of art, which would have seemed just outrageous a few centuries before, and now we have the goddess of love, etc. Okay, so you start to see that, and there was a lot of cultural change going on at this time, and Machiavelli was a part of that. Political thought was a part of that. Just as previously in the Middle Ages, one of the most important questions would have been, how does a leader stay right with God? How does a leader follow God's instructions for how to rule? Okay? During the Renaissance, the question could become, what's the smart way to rule? What works? Without God entering into the equation. Okay? And so that's where Machiavelli's at. Okay? And to show you how consciously Machiavelli did this, I just wanted to discuss this previous form of writing that had existed during the medieval period, okay? Which he mimics, but he changes to make his own points. The Prince is written in this mirror form, or what was called, is called, a mirror book, okay? And these books during the Middle Ages were mirror books because you literally could read the book and reflect upon yourself, upon your character. Some of you may be familiar with the term examination of conscience that the Catholics still encourage people to do. And you get this list of questions that you ask yourself. Have I done this? Have I done that? Am I this? Am I that? And at the end of doing that, you have a better picture of where you're at morally in life and in relation to other people. Well, these mirror books were kind of like that, an examination of conscience. And they were written typically towards leaders, okay, princes, nobility, with the idea of having them think about, are they following God's laws? Are they good Christian leaders? Are they doing things that violate those rules and so forth? Okay? Christine de Pizan is a famous mirror writer whose works you can still find, sometimes definitely on Amazon.com, sometimes in a bookstore or a library. And she actually involved the other classes as well, but it still reflected this medieval feudal view that different classes had different purposes under God. So you had the nobles, and they were the representatives of God, and you had the church, and they really spoke for God, and you had the peasants, and they were to obey, and obey the church and the nobles, and that was their role. Okay? So Christine's advice books are somewhat like that. They push the envelope a little bit when it comes to women, because she was a woman. So she wrote particularly about women's responsibilities, and did just a little bit to question, I guess, women's role during that time, but just a little bit. I mean, for the most part, the only way in which she did that really was to include women in the discussion. So Machiavelli's book is like the mirror book in form, but not in substance. Okay? And I'm sure he did this intentionally. It's a short book. It's written to the prince. It's about how he should behave. And if you have this edition, you'll notice that time after time after time, Machiavelli uses the term virtù, or virtue. Okay? And he uses it in a completely different way. Whereas somebody like Christine would have used virtue to mean moral virtue or Christian virtue, Machiavelli uses it as in virtuosity, skill, ability, prowess. Okay? So he uses it completely differently, but he's using the same word. And he'll even say, a prince with virtue does this. A virtuous prince does that. Okay? Much like the previous mirror writers would, but what these princes do is quite different. Okay? A virtuous prince for Machiavelli may be somebody who lies, who kills people if necessary, who abuses religion if necessary, and so forth. Okay? So, in this way, he certainly broke with tradition, and he shows the spirit of the Renaissance, because the spirit of the Renaissance was questioning the old ways of thinking, okay, and posing new ways, and he certainly does that. Machiavelli claims that he has discovered a radically new way of politics. He says, I have discovered new modes and orders, new ways. It's a question as to whether he actually discovered completely new ways, because we've already met a couple of realists from the ancient world who in some ways thought very much like Machiavelli. But Machiavelli is trying to make a very systematic philosophy, so in that way he's doing something new, okay? And he's going to promote the idea that if the prince follows his advice, his policies, then he will be able to create a government that will last and will not be so assailable from internal and external opponents, okay? And provide people, therefore, with a stable environment in which they can prosper. Big problem for most people at this time was, as soon as they started to save up some money or to get a little bit of property and build the foundations to make more money, the latest invading force would come through, or bandits, would come through and rob them, and they'd be back to the beginning again. And in that kind of environment, you cannot succeed. You cannot grow your wherewithal and make the world a better place. So Machiavelli had a goal of making it a peaceful place, a place where people could prosper. And to do that, he said, we need to turn away from questions about what ought to be to what really is. So he very consciously rejects idealism. He says many people have thought about ways that you can be more moral, or you can be more perfect, but those ways don't bring you success. Therefore, I'm going to dispense with talking about those things, and I'm going to talk about what actually works. It's dedicated to Lorenzo, so that one of those letters that you're going to be reading is to Lorenzo. And I hope that you notice that it's full of flowery diplomatic language, so that your first impression will probably be that he's kissing Lorenzo's butt, more or less. But read it carefully, and you may see some messages even within that letter that question whether Lorenzo is actually that great of a prince. Okay? So watch for that. Some people say he wrote this book just to gain favor with Lorenzo. Okay? We don't know that. He doesn't say that, so we don't know that. But certainly one of his goals was, because he gave Lorenzo a copy of it. No evidence that Lorenzo ever read it. But he did give it as a gift to him. That's why he wrote the letter. Okay? And it was supposed to demonstrate to Lorenzo that Machiavelli had lots of knowledge that he could use. Okay? So it didn't work for him, but that had to be one of his goals. On the other hand, as we read through The Prince, I think you'll find there's a lot of advice in here that's not directly related to that goal. So there may be other things at work here besides that. He says in this letter to Lorenzo, he says that just as artists study the mountains from down on the plains to get a perspective so that they can see the mountains. So he is, as a lowly person, a man of the people, able to look up and see the prince and to understand his ways. Okay? Now, think about that for a moment. If the prince was really, really carefully reading that, what might he take from that about Machiavelli's attitude towards him? Would that be something that he'd usually encounter, this type of sentiment that somebody down in the lower classes of society can understand the ways of the prince because they're down in the lower classes? Yeah, it's something you might hear today, that the common people understand the government better than the people who lead it understand it because they're caught up in Washington in our case or whatever. You hear people say that all the time. People live in Washington, don't know what the rest of the world's like, and they're out of touch with reality, etc. That's not what you would hear coming out of most people back then. And certainly the prince wouldn't have been used to hearing about it. And if he had read it carefully, he would have maybe gotten angry. Because who is this man who's not even of noble birth and is currently in exile as a criminal, trying to tell me that he knows about what I do and has a better perspective on it? Okay? Machiavelli's implying something that he really believes, which is that people in power tend to not be able to see what they do and what they think clearly because they're caught up. Their ego is large and they're caught up in what they're doing and they can't gain that perspective, okay? And this book gives them, at least he thinks, that perspective which they lack, so that they can actually become self-critical, for instance, and ask, is this really the right decision? Just because I feel this way, is this actually going to get me what I want? Okay? Machiavelli thinks a lot of people in power don't ask those questions about long-term self-interest, that they just do what feels good, okay? And sometimes that doesn't succeed. So there's an indication of Machiavelli's attitude, which might not have been too welcome, I guess, at court. Right? Machiavelli is claiming that to be critical and to see the truth, you have to be on the outside. And as I just indicated, that ego tends to obscure one's vision, the vision of the prince in particular. Okay? In a way, we've already discovered this from reading the Gorgias. Well, Socrates says that a person like a rhetorician gets caught up in the power of his speech and becomes a slave to his passions and makes poor decisions that sometimes backfire. Well, here we have Machiavelli saying the same thing, and he's not an idealist. But in order to get what you really want, sometimes you have to step back from your passions. Let's say that the prince is particularly enamored with women. Okay? If he spends all of his time trying to have affairs with all the women at court, he certainly isn't going to have enough time to be able to plan and strategize against his enemies and for his friends, okay, etc. Okay? So nobody has all the hours in the world. And Machiavelli wants to try to focus the leader's attention on what's really important. He teaches that just because you want to do something, let's say that somebody has wronged you or insulted you, and you'd like to kill them, which I'm sure we've all felt like doing from time to time, that doesn't mean you should. You should think about, again, your long-term self-interest. Perhaps this is somebody who could be important to you down the road. Perhaps this is somebody who could do something for you, and especially if you have leverage over them at the moment. Okay? So step back from your anger, because there may be something out of this that you can get that is much more valuable than simply killing this person. Okay? That's the way of thinking that Machiavelli promotes. Okay? So certainly that's a comment on human nature, and one that runs throughout this book, is the danger of egotism, the danger of not being able to think coldly and clearly. And it may be his downfall too, because if he expects people in positions of power to think clearly and without passion, he may be expecting too much. I mean, that could be a legitimate criticism of Machiavelli's position. Realists do that. Realists always say, knock off all the emotionalism and think about your self-interest. But that doesn't seem to be the way people actually think a lot of the time, unfortunately. You have to train your mind to think that way. And Machiavelli provides a roadmap, but he can't make people do it. So how many people will be able to do this? That's an open question. Well, some people think that Machiavelli's teaching is dangerous, and they tend to criticize him because he promotes immorality. So there's so many ways in which we could illustrate this point or this criticism. But here's one example that happens early on that you'll be encountering in the first chapters of your book, chapter 2 here. Machiavelli says that those princes who hold their power because they've inherited it from their fathers, let's say, okay, have an easy job, because all they have to do, no matter what their father was like as a prince or a king, all they have to do is do what he did. Even if he was rather cruel, okay, even if he didn't do anything for the welfare of people, doesn't matter, because people are used to that, and human nature allows us to adapt. And we become used to something, even if it's harsh, we would prefer it to a change that we don't know. Okay? So that's another observation about human nature that Machiavelli provides. People are conservative by nature in the sense that they would rather stick with what they know, even if it's bad, than what they don't know. And so he says, just do what he did. If you do anything else, then people may start to question you. There may be some chinks that people can find in the armor, so to speak. And if you get overthrown by somebody, as soon as whoever that is makes a mistake of any kind, the people are going to want to do everything they can to get you back, because they're going to look back to the old days and say, boy, it was better then. At least we knew what to count on. At least we knew where we stood, okay, what the rules were. So then he turns to, what do you do if you acquire new territory, which is a nice word for conquer, okay? What if you are the conqueror? How do you keep and hold power then? It's easy if you just inherit it, but let's say you take it, okay? Well, Machiavelli says that's what I'm going to talk a lot more about, because the other is easy. So he's going to spend a lot of his time talking about how you take and keep power, okay? And his advice is very clear, and I'll put that up here. This will be my last one. But this is a more literal translation of what appears on your page 7, down towards the bottom. Yours says, and I like this translation anyway, but yours says you always have to give offense. Give offense to those over whom you acquire power when you become a new ruler, both by imposing troops upon them and by countless other injuries that follow as necessary consequences of the acquisition of power. Or he must always hurt those whose new prince he becomes, and hurt them with men-at-arms and with infinite other injuries that the new acquisition drags with it. And we will find that what Machiavelli says is when you first get there, you have to make sure people know they cannot disobey you at all. Therefore, you cannot wait until you find somebody who's actually done something wrong. You have to find somebody to hurt. You have to make examples so that people know that you're serious, okay? So I'll push that up. When we come back next time, we'll pick up there, okay?